So one of the reasons we're really excited and interested in freshwater mussels is because North America has the highest diversity of freshwater mussels in the world. There are about 600 species in the group worldwide, but here in North America we have between 300 and 350 species. Kind of depends on who's doing the naming. And then even beyond that, here in Southwest Virginia, we have some of the highest diversity of freshwater mussels in the US. So we're responsible for more mussels, more species of mussels than anybody else in the world. And we haven't done a very good job of taking care of them long term. 2/3 of mussel species are endangered. In fact, if you can look up here on this graph, if you can see it, you can see that freshwater mussels are some of the most endangered organisms in North America. More endangered than the mammals that you think about, or the birds. You know, everybody likes birds and mammals, fuzzy things, you know, they're brightly colored. They're really pretty easy to see in comparison to freshwater mussels. But it's not just freshwater mussels, it's actually freshwater mollusks in general. This includes all kinds of freshwater snails. In fact, freshwater snails are even more endangered than freshwater mussels. But one of the problems is we just don't know anything about snails, really. We know that they're there, and we're working on determining what species there are, but we just don't know very much about their biology and why they're not doing well in some places and in others. So it's something we're working on. When it comes to conservation, I work at the Aquatic Wildlife Conservation Center in Marion, Virginia. And at the Aquatic Wildlife Conservation Center, we actually work to restore mussel populations, snail populations, and hellbenders. You guys know what a hellbender is? North America's largest freshwater salamander. So we get to work with all kinds of aquatic organisms that have declined for one reason or another. It's passed around. This is actually a snail shell. It's called the Spiny river snail. It's the largest native freshwater snail in North America. Unfortunately, this is not a spiny shell. They have spiny and non-spiny varieties. So you can find both in the same places in rivers. In the Clinch in particular, there are really good populations of spiny snails in a couple of spots where they haven't been impacted by major pollution events. So, but something interesting to note, the Native Americans really did depend on freshwater mussels as a food source. As you move down the Tennessee River system into the lower Tennessee and into Alabama, there are huge midden piles or piles of shells where the Native Americans harvested the mussels. But in order to consume them, what we think they did was they took them, they shucked them, they dried them, and they ground them up into like a protein powder. And they'd add it to other things. So it's, you know, like your protein shake every day. Well, the Native Americans did that with freshwater mussels. So they were historically edible, and
how did they preserve them?
They were dried, and dried meat products tend to not decay as quickly. There are stories from the Civil War in journals that soldiers tried to eat them when they were starving, and they found that they made them very, very sick. But whether that was because of the pollutants going into the water, because they were harvesting mussels right below camps along rivers, so there were bacteria going into those mussel populations, or there could be natural bacteria populations which would make the soldiers sick. You know, they weren't very good for eating then, and I really discourage everyone from eating them now. The other side of that, it's actually illegal to harvest freshwater mussels in Virginia. You're not even allowed to possess shells without a permit, because coming back to why we're interested in freshwater mussels, they're so endangered. And if you look here at the table, you realize that they generally look pretty similar. So you have to be an expert in order to know what you have. And so most of the time, people who harvest them from the river don't know what species they have. And you could be harvesting something extraordinarily rare. You could be harvesting one of the last 10 of a mussel species. And that would really impact our ability to recover some of these species. If you take a look here, you can see on this map the kind of color coding. You can see how many different species there are in a river. And this is species currently. There may have been as many as 10 to 20 more species in these rivers that have gone extinct or that have been extirpated from Virginia. So if you look here in the Clinch Powell-Holston system, there are historically more than 50 species of mussels. In reality, we're down to about 35 in really good sites. We just don't find some of these species in Virginia at all. They're still doing really well elsewhere, but we're trying to figure out through survey techniques, looking at their biology, looking at the changes in the river to figure out why they're not here anymore and if we can return them. So, does anybody know anything about the life cycle of freshwater mussels? Why we might be really interested in it, just from a cool organism standpoint? Freshwater mussels have a larval stage, just kind of like a butterfly, if you're familiar with a caterpillar pupal stage. Well, freshwater mussels have a larval stage. It's really simple. It's a little critter. It just has 2 shells. All it can do is open and close. There are separate sexes in freshwater mussels. So the males release sperm into the water. The females, while they're filter feeding, actually take in those sperm. The eggs are fertilized and then they're stored inside the female's gills. So she's actually kind of caring for her babies as they grow and develop into those little bitty larvae. And then she doesn't just release those mussels out into the river as baby mussels. She actually has to have a host fish in order for those babies to transform into mussels. So if you take a look here, this is a photograph of some of what we call the glochidia, or that larval stage. They have to attach the gills, the skin, the fins of a fish. You can see right here, this is actually a photograph of the gills of a fish. The red is the gills and the pink, or the whitish pinkish is the actual baby mussels. They'll spend anywhere from 5 days to 3 months on that fish, developing all the things they need to live, gills and a foot, and then they drop off and they start life as a baby mussel. So if you take a look right here, these are actually a photograph of some baby mussels. How big do you think those larvae would have to be to attach the gills of fish? Yeah. Imagine taking a grain of salt and dividing it in thirds. They're microscopic. So those larval mussels will attach, and we've actually learned that they do get a little bit from the fish. They get some resources from the fish. We still aren't sure about all the details of how it works, but we're learning more. And can you guys think of any reason why that fish might provide a service to the mussel? How that might serve the mussel? If you think about rivers and water flowing downstream.
Are they cleaning the fish? I mean, in the way that they're formed, I mean, do they withdraw some bacteria or something from the fish that is harmful to the fish?
They don't actually, but they do actually help the fish in one way. They decrease the likelihood of other parasites being able to attach. They actually prime the immune system. If you think about getting a vaccine, the mussels actually kind of act in the same way. They prime the immune system, and so the fish is more able to fight off other parasites. But how would the fish serve the mussels?
To distribute them.
Exactly. The fish actually kind of helps those babies stay upstream. If you think about it, if those baby mussels just got washed downstream every time, pretty quickly they'd be back in the ocean. And we wouldn't have any mussels in these upstream habitats. So those fish actually act kind of like an anchor, keeping those baby mussels in these upstream habitats while they develop. And then they can drop off into those habitats where their parents are found. Some species of fish are really active. If you like to fish, you know how much fish will move like from reservoirs up into headwater streams during certain seasons of the year. Sometimes mussels take advantage of that and are able to be distributed much further upstream or into new habitats. So the fish act as a great distributor for those larval stages.
So do they require moving water?
Most mussels do. There are some species that are really specialized for living in non-flowing water or slowly flowing water. And part of that is because they're filter feeders, so they have to have access to the water column in order to feed, but they also need to live in clean habitats. And so if you think about a lake bottom, the water's moving really slowly, so sediments tend to accumulate on the edges and it gets really mucky. Most mussel species just aren't adapted for those habitats, and those fine sediments will clog their gills, and so they're not able to feed effectively and they'll starve. There are some mussel species that are really well adapted for those habitats. In fact, probably the largest mussel species you're going to find in Virginia is found in these kind of lakes, and they're really good at colonizing new habitats. This is called a giant floater. If you guys want to take it and kind of pass it around, you can see exactly how light it is. And it gets its name because when the animal inside dies, the decomposition where those tissues are breaking down, those bacteria are releasing gas, the shell is so light that it will actually float the mussel shell. So sometimes in lakes you'll find these animals floating, and that's where the animal died, and it's just floating along in the river current. So mussel shells or mussel species get all kinds of different names, either based on someone's really creative idea of what something looked like, or based on some character that somebody sees. So some freshwater mussel species actually have to use specific host fish. So we have a really simple animal. It's got 1 foot, no eyes, a couple gills, they don't move too much. How do you think a mussel might actually target a host fish? How do you target a fish when you go fishing?
So they have something that sticks out and wiggles, attracts the fish.
Yeah, you use a specific type of lure to attract the host fish, or to attract a fish when you're fishing. Well, mussels actually kind of do the same thing. And if you take a look up here, you can see this is a good photograph of a mussel displaying her lure. This is the shell of the mussel. This is her foot. And it is a female because she's luring. The males don't have these lures at all. But then if you look right here, does that look like something to you guys? You might have to come closer.
Crawfish, maybe?
Maybe.
Or a minnow even. It's like an eye and gills almost.
Yeah, I think it looks a lot like a minnow. And apparently the host fish do as well. This mussel species uses bass, largemouth bass, smallmouth bass. Those fish are piscivorous. They eat other fish primarily. So this mussel has this lure stuck up here. You can kind of see there's like an eye here, maybe a fin, and then the tail. Bass is swimming along, think he's going to get lunch, comes down and actually takes a bite of that. And instead of getting lunch, he actually breaks open the gills of the female mussel where she's holding those larvae, and he gets infected. The fish infects himself with those larvae. So personally, I just think this is absolutely amazing, because if you think about it, this mussel doesn't know what a fish looks like. It doesn't chase down its host fish, but it's still really, really successful at targeting a single species of fish. If you look down here, what does that look like?
Intestinal worms. Yeah,
It looks a lot like a worm. That is the lure produced by this mussel species. It's called a fan shell. And we think it looks like a worm. We presume fish think it looks like a worm too. So the mussel will actually stick just part of this out of its shell. This is it curled up in its gills. We call it a conglutinate, or it's a packet of those larvae. The red color comes from some unfertilized eggs. So it's sticking out of the shell, waving in the current a little bit. The fish comes along, pulls it out, and then they tend to fight over it, because it's like, oh, that looks like good food to me too. So you get 5 or 6 fish fighting over this food source, and they all get infected. I think that's pretty amazing. If you look here, if you look really closely, the white part that you see in the photograph is actually the larvae of the mussel. So those conglutinates are only about maybe this long. Anybody familiar with freshwater insects, aquatic insects? Yeah? Do those look like something you might know?
Mayfly or something.
Well, they actually really closely resemble the larval and pupal stages of black flies. Yes. The live insects, the larval stage is able to lay down silk. They have little hooks on their rear end. They'll lay that silk down on a rock, they'll hook on, and they'll wave there feeding in the current. Well, these packets of the larvae of the mussel so closely mimic those larvae in that they actually have a little adhesive patch here on the end, and so they stick to rocks. They use darters. Let's see. Kidney shell use darters as their host. The mussel that produces these is another type of kidney shell. You can take a look here. It's actually pretty similar. But these resemble just another pupal stage, the pupal stage of a black fly larvae. And if you take a look online, if you look up freshwater mussels, you can actually find some side-by-side photographs of these pupal stages of these aquatic insects and the freshwater mussel packets. We have another photograph of the actual lure, the mantle lure of a freshwater mussel down here. You can see it's a little bit larger, so you can see the eye and the tail a little bit more clearly. And then I think you suggested that it looked a little bit like a crayfish. We'll take a look down here. This is the one we think looks most like a crayfish.
Yeah, indeed.
This is the lure produced by this mussel species. It's called the rainbow. It's a widespread mussel species that's found all over the Midwest, up into Tennessee. It's pretty common in smaller streams. It's not an endangered species. But these mussels will come up and lay at the surface, and then these little fingers you see are actually part of the mantle of the mussel, the part of the mussel that where the mussel actually attaches to its shell. And so they just wiggle, and it looks a lot like a crayfish. They tend to come up in the evening and at night, when they're probably more successful at fooling the fish, because these guys are in really clear water, and so they have to be better mimics. And then, personally, my favorite group of freshwater mussels is the group that actually bites back on those fish. So if you take a look right down here, this is an oyster mussel. You can kind of take a look. Let me see if this one has better teeth so you can feel. This is the female of this species. They're sexually dimorphic, which means that the shells are different. We can just look at them and tell the difference between a male and a female. But this is the oyster mussel. This is a federally endangered mussel. It's very rare. It's down to just 2 populations, one in the Clinch and one in the Nolichucky River. Yes. And this mussel, during the spring, she'll come up, and in addition to holding those larvae in her gills, if you look here in this photograph, she's sitting up above the surface, kind of like this, open. But if you notice, you can't really see the inside of the critter. You can't see down into her shell in the photograph. You see these white things. Those are called mantle pads, and they're kind of an iridescent bluish white. And you can see them from above the surface of the water. So if you walk out into the Clinch River in certain areas during the spring, you'll see these things that look like silver dollars, bright new silver dollars laying on the surface. And it's actually those mantle pads of those freshwater mussels. So what you can see here is that mantle pad. And then what you can't really see in the photograph are these 2 little twiddly things. They look like 2 little fingers moving around. These guys use darters as well. So darters are curious. Somebody gets brave, they all kind of hang out watching. Somebody gets brave, and they stick their head inside, and the mussel closes. And then those mantle pads act like a gasket, and they kind of seal around the head of the fish, and the mussel starts releasing glochidia into her just into her body cavity. And so the fish is gasping for air because it's completely panicking. What in the world is happening? Let me out of here. It gets infected with those glochidia all over its gills, on its body, on its fins. So unfortunately, sometimes the fish that actually gets infected doesn't survive that experience. But darters are curious. So that darter starts struggling, panicking. Well, all its friends come in to see what's going on. And so that fish is struggling around, stirring up the water. Those larvae are suspended all up in the water column. All the other fish that come in to investigate actually get infected with the larvae at the same time. And so even if that individual fish doesn't survive, that mussel is pretty successful in getting its larvae onto the fish. This is another species in that same group. And on this one, you can actually feel the teeth on the edge of the shell. So if you look at this kind of protuberance here, feel right there and you'll see the teeth. This is called the Cumberlandian Comb shell. It's another federally endangered mussel species. That's a female. This is a male I'm passing around afterwards, so you can kind of see how different they are.
This one actually wrote his name in there.
But this is another mussel species that's highly endangered, found only in a couple of populations, and also grabs the darters. If you take a look right up here, you can see it's actually got kind of a different display. It's got these little nubs right here. Fish does the same thing, comes in, investigates, and the mussel closes on its head. It's a really successful design. Now, these mussels, if you're familiar with how species are organized, they're all in one genus or kind of one group, which all the mussels that are fish grabbers are in the genus Epioblasma. Epioblasma is the most endangered genus in North America. In fact, every species in the genus is federally protected now. These are also the group of animals that have been most impacted. About 2/3 of the species in the genus have gone extinct. We have about 26 left. Well, if you think about it, these mussels need clear water in order for the darters to be able to see them to come in and to feed. These mussels were also most common in riffles and high points in the Clinch, the Powell, the Holston, the Tennessee river systems. If you're familiar with rivers at all and building dams, we really like to build dams on stable places. Well, unfortunately, riffles are pretty much the most stable place in a river. You know, they're usually underlain by bedrock, or there's something around that keeps the river from changing around them. So those are all the places where we built dams. So we submerged most of these animals in a couple 100 feet of water. They don't do too well down there. If you got to feel the teeth on the shell, they're pretty sharp, right? Grab pretty well. There was a mussel species called the cat's paw in this genus. It's gone extinct. It was as big as my hand. It had teeth. So if you can imagine a mussel as big as my hand with teeth as sharp as this, it probably would have been big enough to grab a hold of your toe. It would have been pretty amazing to get to see that kind of animal in the river. So I talk about all these endangered species. You know, we've got the oyster mussel and the Cumberlandian comb shell. They're both endangered. We've only got 2 populations. Well, we're lucky. There are actually some mussel species that we thought were completely extinct that we found new populations of. Not here in Virginia, unfortunately, but the purple cat's paw has recently reappeared in Ohio. We thought it was completely gone, and then just in the past 2 years, somebody's been able to go out and actually find more of these mussels. Just a few, but enough that we might actually be able to recover the mussel species. So that's really exciting. If you're as amazed by just the kind of diversity and all the cool things that these mussels do, then it's great to know that things aren't completely gone. Now, we talked about the ecosystem services side, or the things that mussels provide for us. I said they're filter feeders, which means that they remove things from the water. How do you think that helps us out?
Most of your water comes from the rivers.
Exactly. Mussels are really good at removing all kinds of things from water. Actually, unfortunately, mussels are better than wastewater treatment plants at removing all kinds of things from water, including pharmaceuticals. If you're not aware of it, most of the drugs that go into our water treatment plants actually aren't very effectively removed. Some are, but most aren't. Mussels are great at removing them from the water column. Unfortunately, you know, those things happen to be, you know, upstream of endangered mussel populations as well as less endangered mussel populations. And so those things can really change the biology of how these animals work. I was talking about this complex life cycle. Well, some mussel species, you know, only display or brood during certain periods of the year. Some of these pharmaceuticals actually cause the males to release sperm early, or they cause the females to release eggs early. They do all kinds of crazy things to change the biology of these organisms. So while the mussels are providing this great service for us, we're also really, really negatively impacting some of these populations. Something pretty cool about mussels, though, they are great they aren't just filter feeders, they're great filter feeders. An average mussel bed, which is what we call an area where there are lots of mussels congregated together in a river. You know, we use all kinds of definitions, like maybe 10 or 15 mussels per square meter. You know, this is about a square meter. Well, that's about a square meter. They can filter, 100 mussels can filter the entire water of a family of 4 within a few days. We're talking about close to 525,000 gallons of water is about the average use of a household in a year. And that 100 mussels can actually filter that volume in a couple of days. So they're amazingly effective at filtering the water.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know the North Fork of the Holston has mercury in it, and you can't keep fish.
Right.
Well, if a mussel filters and ingests mercury, when the mussel dies, the mercury will go right back into the river?
It is, but you have to think about it this way. Because mussels live in the bottom of a river. They don't live up in the water column like a fish. So when mussels bioaccumulate these heavy metals, the mercury, those things tend to be trapped in the bottom of the river. Sometimes they're eaten, but a lot of times the tissues just break down and some of those heavy metals are kind of cached in the substrate. They don't go away, unfortunately, but they are kind of removed from the water column and they're stored in the bottom. Now, if you've ever had any experience with, if you're in an area where they're removing a dam, this is something that we really worry about because all those heavy metals, those contaminants are stored in the substrate. And so when you remove a dam, there tends to be a lot of sediment right behind a dam, and those things are all released out into the water then. So in areas like the Olin site, it's a real concern, any kind of disturbance of the substrate, not just killing mussels, which the Olin plant killed a huge number of mussels. That mercury, while mussels can actually bioaccumulate those things at a certain level, even mussels can't live with contaminants above a certain level. Those thresholds are not terribly high, but so we've got these two sides of it. Mussels can really help us by removing things from the water column, these pollutants, and storing them in the bottom. But mussels can only live in certain areas. So they have to be so clean before we can actually put mussels back to have them help us clean it. Mussels are pretty sensitive to pollutants, and the more endangered it is, it kind of correlates with their ability to withstand pollutants. We have some more common species that are able to withstand some of these things. That rainbow mussel I passed around earlier is less sensitive, but still, they're pretty sensitive to things. There have actually been some attempts to use freshwater mussels, especially up in the Pacific Northwest, as like a secondary treatment for wastewater, and they've had some success. So those animals would have been raised at a facility like the Aquatic Wildlife Conservation Center and then put out, and then those animals can clean that water. But the water has to be a certain level of clean before we can put those mussels out and actually demand that they provide that service. Another service that mussels provide is they're a pretty good food source for all kinds of things that we really enjoy seeing. You know, if you like to see muskrat or otter, all kinds of wading birds, mussels are a pretty good food source for them. During certain seasons of the year, mussels are a main food source for muskrat. So unfortunately, sometimes they like to feed on our endangered mussels that we've put out in places where we're trying to restore populations.